Good evening, everyone. What happened to our host, Father, our guest?
Wait.
Ethan dropped off. I think he lost connection. But welcome to It Is Direct Line. And it is Wednesday. Our guest is having technical difficulties, but we are here. Our guest is Ethan Gutmann. He'll be joining us shortly from Victims of Communism, China Desk, author of Slaughterhouse. Our guest host tonight is Don Irvine, filling in for the ailing Jackie Saxton. Get well soon, Jackie.
Yes.
And Mark. While we wait for Ethan, I think, why don't we talk about the bridge collapse? I'll wait for Ethan, actually.
Well, it's fascinating that it happened at 1 o'clock in the morning. It just can imagine how much worse it would have been if it was during a busier time and it was harder to give people the block the roads, which is obviously something that they were able to save a lot of lives with, but it would have been harder at that time.
Yeah, and I tell you,
I suspect we should prioritize letting Dwight communicate with Ethan.
Why don't you and Don talk about yourself? I'm texting Ethan right now.
There's only a limited amount of multitasking that Dwight can do in this particular moment.
The real conspiracy theory is that somehow Ethan got disconnected, right?
Well, it was the Chinese. It was the Chinese.
Right. They have hacked into the system and managed to prevent Ethan from signing on for the live show.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he was on in the green room. I mean, everyone
was
saw
so
him for
weird.
Split second. And I just sent Ethan a message saying, "Hey, we lost your connection."
So
maybe he dropped a cigarette somewhere where he shouldn't have.
Yeah.
So are we allowed to smoke on?
Yeah.
I've never seen him. He smokes in the green room, but not when we're airing.
Yeah.
You know what's
Right,
funny?
There's no question about that.
You know what's funny? I was talking to somebody today, and they were saying how if somebody were, they'll bring back smoking sections for the pot folks in restaurants, to accommodate them because they were all, because they're very anti-smokers, which I'm not against getting rid of the smoking sections in restaurants because one of my favorite places, Stained Glass Pub, you'd smell like an ashtray leaving. Hey, our guest is on.
There we go.
Welcome back, Ethan.
Sorry
Those
about that.
Chinese, hackers, they try to keep us down.
We were going to say we were talking in the green room about various first of all, welcome and welcome back. But we were talking in the green room about various conspiracy theories, the Chinese infiltration and what have you. And obviously, if you believe the conspiracy theory, we have captured the attention of the Chinese intelligence services. What do you think?
All apps are Chinese these days, really. Don't quote me on that. I just thought I'd open it up for discussion here. No, that's a SteamYard problem. They suddenly decided they didn't like the browser I was on, that kind of thing.
Well, let's since we're talking about apps, let's talk about TikTok. And what are your thoughts about whether or not the U.S. should be banning that?
My thought was we should have banned it right from the beginning because of its surveillance architecture. Not that I'm here. I'm going with Connor Healy of IPVM, who I've discussed this with, and he's a real expert. That's what IPVM does. It's their main hobby is looking at Chinese surveillance, and they're very, very good at it. Probably second to none in the world. I think so. I think it's a major problem, the surveillance capabilities of it. Now, with the fact that we've let everybody become addicted to it is an even greater problem. But it does seem to me that it's sort of on the right track. If we can kind of wrest it away from China in some way, then I guess and they can still get some money out of it. I guess that'll it may work out. But it's shamefully pro-Chinese. That's the other thing TikTok is, and it's shamefully anti-Semitic and a lot of other things too. And it is obviously in just good old-fashioned communist way. It's trying to destroy the minds of the West. So Now that leads us into the whole MK Ultra thing, but that's another story.
Right. Well, it's an interesting challenge because it does set up the fact that the Chinese have moved so quickly in adopting surveillance technologies. I mean, there was a couple of decades ago. I'm trying to remember the exact quote. I was reading it recently, but the quote about from I think Bill Clinton talking about how difficult it would be. I think it was something about like pinning Jello to the wall or something like that. But his quote was that the internet would basically make a police state surveillance system impossible. And of course, we're seeing with China just the opposite. I mean, they have really weaponized technology to be that much more intrusive and to follow their citizens.
My first article, really as an adult, was done on that. It was called "Who Lost China's Internet?" Came out of the Weekly Standard, and it went after a couple of American corporations because they were the main pushers at that time. They were the pimps, and they one was Yahoo and the other was and Motorola to some extent for police equipment, but mainly it was Cisco at the time. But Huawei grew out of that, and Huawei literally took Cisco routers and put the same serial numbers on them when they copied them. Okay, exactly the same serial numbers that America was using. Basically, the problem was that this was a gold rush, and China was a gold rush, but also those companies were starting to run into real problems at home with the .com bust, and you saw this, and China was their savior. So, in some ways, I think the big difference is, I mean, if you want to look at it from a more optimistic stance, is that we're better off today because a lot of businesses have moved out of China. Now, China doesn't need them as much and doesn't need the technology as much. As you say, their surveillance is second to none. But there is no question that from the beginning, the Chinese were thinking Beijing was thinking exactly in those terms. This is not Jello to the wall. This is not something that's going to destroy an authoritarian state. This is the ultimate police tool. This is the telescreen come to life. It watches you, you watch it. So.
By all accounts, one of the things that looms large in Z's analysis of the world is the fall of the Soviet Union, and he has thought a lot about how China can avoid the same sets of issues, and he's sort of proceeding down a path in a variety of ways to do that. Any thoughts about that?
About exactly. You were
but how this notion that sort of central to Z's sort of political calculus is A, staying in power, but B, avoiding, which is not typical of politicians everywhere, but also specifically avoiding what happened with the Soviet Union.
I think what's happened under Xi is kind of unusual that way, because actually the Belt and Road Initiative was really a kind of rehash of what the Soviet Union did. That is, they put out a lot of loans, a lot of expenditure, a lot of investment into third world countries, and it did not pay off. Over time, it created massive debt. For a while, it looked like they were kind of winning the battle in many continents, but really all they were doing was winning some UN votes, it turned out. It didn't really matter. So I think there's been some terrible errors that she has made that are exactly leading back to the Soviet track. And we're particularly seeing that now with the collapse of not collapse, I hate that word when it comes to China, because China is very durable on some level, because the culture is very durable. And it's an ingenious culture. But this massive downturn in the Chinese economy, unlike anything any of us have ever seen in our lifetimes post Deng Xiaoping, right? Deng Xiaoping took the economy and made it move and flourish. We saw it, but right now this is looking like the tiger that's not going to roar. And they are the only economy in practically almost the only one in the world, I think, that, it came out of did not get a real boom coming out of COVID. Everybody else got a boom pretty much. I mean, there may be some exceptions, but not really. We're all still feeling the effects of that post-COVID initial boom. They're feeling just the opposite, a massive retraction. So I don't think he is sort of following the Soviet idea to some extent. And he's beginning to think apparently about resolving his problems domestically by foreign adventurism, particularly with Taiwan. That's a Soviet playbook. That wasn't the Chinese playbook. That's what made China, in fact, so threatening was their ingeniousness. They were not going to fall like the Soviet Union. They were not going to have that happen. They weren't going to end up like Ceausescu. But she has painted that country into a corner.
So one of the issues that's certainly of note is we were talking about the economy, and before we were talking about the difficulty of getting statistics. So unlike most countries where you can, you've got outside bodies that can kind of validate numbers and you can make rough estimates. With China, they've been announcing, various growth figures over a period of time, and increasingly there's a thought of what's the right figure to figure out as a discount, that they're not really growing as fast as all that.
I don't know what that right figure is. I know that 5.3%, if you put me next to a cliff and had a gun aimed at my head and said, is it 5.3%? I'd say, no, it isn't.
Right.
Shoot me, whatever. I'm going over. No, that is not a real figure. And we used to be able to correct for that kind of those growth figures, mass GDP growth figures, by looking at it on the provincial level, which often would be reporting something quite different. Usually the provincial level was inflated in ways, actually, because every province is trying to show that they're doing really well. But nonetheless, you'd see discrepancies there. And you'd mainly see discrepancies in energy consumption. So energy consumption, but the figures we're getting out of China, the gross figures, I don't believe are quite real now either. So we're really in la la land. I mean, we're also getting, for the first time in a year, we're getting figures about Chinese youth unemployment, and those aren't plausible either. This has always been a problem in China. Don't get me wrong. I mean, even when I was a businessman there, I used to tell a business consultant, I used to tell them, don't believe the figures that your Chinese partner is giving you. They're always political on some level, even if it's tapioca production, okay? It's not quite real. And they're usually trying to lower the number so they don't have to pay as many taxes or heat it up, okay? Hot it up somehow. And, you really have to be very suspicious. That's nothing compared to what we're looking at now, okay? The bottom has really fallen out. The credibility is really gone. And of course, we don't know truly what's going on in the real estate
Right.
situation. It's hard to understand. You've seen the ghost cities. They're real. You've seen the riots, the amount of incidents, but those aren't reported anymore either. They used to be actually reported that there were a certain amount of incidents, and the police broke up so many demonstrations and so forth. Those are all gone too.
So it's worth talking about the real estate, because that in some ways is the heart of darkness for some of the economic problems. That it used to be, the rough figure was that 30% of the economy was devoted to constructing houses, and it was one of the few ways which people could store value. They couldn't buy investments, they could buy an extra apartment. So the question is who's buying those apartments now, when by all accounts the prices are dropping? And again, this is another statistical one. It's hard to know how much, but they are dropping in value. Mortgages are high. They're experiencing some deflation. people really have no incentive now to buy those apartments, which would be, and as you mentioned, they've got massive tens of millions of units that are empty, that were being held, not even rented out, just being held. So the question is who would be buying those apartments now? And if that's not going on, where's that 30% of the economy going? That's a rhetorical. I don't know the answer. That's the challenge, right?
It is the challenge. I mean, this is not. I don't think there's an economist that I've been reading recently, that has a really good explanation of where this is going in China. Now, having said that, I always say that, or I always used to say that the savior of China in every one of these situations is the entrepreneurial nature of the culture. And that means that there's a sort of an official area where you can operate legally, and there's a black market, but there's actually a huge gray market where it's not really clear what the law is exactly, or people know exactly how much they can skip it. And that is the entrepreneurial world that always brings it back. For example, okay, we talk about the state loans going, the state loans going to banks, and loans going to state-owned enterprises, right? Eating up all of the capital of the country. But it wasn't really, because actually the state-owned enterprises were lending lots of that money out to entrepreneurs very quietly at high inflated interest rates, and they were paying it back because they were starting all kinds of new things. In fact, that's how China got to TikTok and things like that. That's how they got .coms and all that and apps. So that was the savior. That seems to have been wiped out by COVID, because it was just too long in China. It went on too long, 3 years, where you could not do anything, where you could not really operate properly. I mean, yes, you could make maybe some of the apps, but not a lot of the stuff that wasn't virtual. You couldn't do anything with it. So that's my feeling, is that's really where the problem is it's the hidden economy, not black market again, gray market economy, is not coming back.
So one of the areas that has been very strong, and it's kind of worth talking because of its impact in the United States, is electric vehicles, EVs. And in there are a variety of companies, but one in particular, BYD. I think that was it Build Your Dream or BYD, something like that. But anyway, BYD. Maybe it's because of the deflation going on, whatever. They've managed to drop the price now of their cheapest vehicle under $10,000. Now you could probably argue that it's heavily subsidized and supported by the government. But then, of course, our EV industry is also heavily supported and subsidized by the government as well. So it's certainly not a free market economy at all.
Sure, but it's not Turkish Airlines either, if you know what I mean. I mean, this is a vanity project. Every environmental project in China has been a vanity project from word go. Every single one, all those, all the photoelectric cells, everything. Okay, the solar panels I see up here in Vermont, they're all Chinese made, and they are always operating at a loss, and the government is always picking up for that because they see this as a really good propaganda point. Because they're such terrible polluters, of course, because they're producing most of the carbon in the world, and they will continue to. They have no plans to stop that. So they're going to flood the market with Chinese EVs. I don't really think, I mean, that's the thing. Industries like that can do okay for a while. China's not totally broke, but it's only a question of time. And I don't really know how this plays out exactly. We've never seen this with an Asian tiger before. Okay, we've seen tiger economies. They come up, they sometimes flatten out like Japan. That's probably what's going to happen with China. But what if it doesn't? What if it really starts to descend? And that's a scenario nobody's really prepared for, except maybe Gordon Chang. I mean, he's been predicting it for longer than anyone. So, maybe he's finally going to get his.
Gordon Chang has been predicting this for at least 20 years, right? I mean, I think it's
25 years.
Right? 25 years? Okay. That sounds. which is fascinating. I mean, it is, and it's the debt consequences is really occurring in slow motion. So it's taking place over a protracted time, which probably is not unexpected given the nature of the closed nature of the economy. It's not like you have the open markets that can react as quickly. Well, let's talk now. You're back from Taiwan and you're working on a book. How much can you tell us about what you're up to?
Well, I mean, it's going to be another one of these extravaganzas. It's not, you always paint the target around the hole you shot in the barn. So it's going to be organ harvesting again, Chinese organ harvesting. So I told my agent I wanted to call it the Slaughter 2. She was like, "That's a stupid name for a book." I was like, "Then Hollywood gets away with it. Why can't I?" So we're calling it the Xinjiang procedure for now, which is a nice technical.
So maybe you should have gone with 2.0.
2.0. All right. Well,
yeah, that would have given it a little bit more. Anyway, so
I think that's a little too Tom Friedman for me. Okay, so but look,
perish that thought.
Yeah, exactly. Really. No, so I think it's going to be about the Uyghurs, because really the sourcing of China's organs has really moved from Falun Gong and maybe the Tibetans to some extent, the House Christians, to the Uyghurs, and pretty squarely and I think it's still there. And so I have a lot of evidence on that, but I'm also writing a major chapter about sex, rape in the camps, in the Uyghur camps, which is simply one witness, one woman. And I believe it blows away anything we've heard of before. I mean, I was just listening to the interview before I got on tonight. I hadn't heard it in a year or two. And I'm shocked, really, by some of the things. It's absolutely overwhelming. Anyways, so that's very strong, and there's some other points as well, and it does get into some Western complicity, or at least Taiwanese complicity in this whole thing. But I think the main thing there is that we're also looking at something very positive, which is we just had a hearing. The CECC, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, just had a hearing. I got to speak at that. So did my colleague Matt Robertson. So did Maya Malapitilova, who's a doctor from Boston, Uyghur doctor and an expert on DNA, and she had some very interesting things to say. Now, but the main change, of course, is that the medical community, that the transplant doctors, at least the heart and lung transplant doctors, have stood up and said, we're boycotting China. And that's a huge change. And that really gives license for the Senate to finally pass the Stop Organ Harvesting Act and for us to move forward on this. I think that's only the Stop Organ Harvesting Act is only the beginning. I think there are going to be some American companies which are going to be in some trouble here, like Thermo Fisher Medical. Possibly even Pfizer might have to do some apologizing. But I think it's essential as part of decoupling from China economically. This is the first part you'd start at. Is let's clean our hands of this organ harvesting in any way. We shouldn't even be doing any testing over there. So
could you elaborate a little bit? I mean, obviously you have been pioneering this work in exposing it. However, it has become, as you mentioned, more mainstream in terms of variety of authoritative sources acknowledging, yes, in fact, this is happening. And I'm sure it was gratifying to see that happen. But what is the Chinese response? It's fascinating that it continues on. Is it just they're going to bowl through it? Or, I mean, it is obviously potentially such a black eye for them, and yet it continues.
Well, I think that's right. And I think I've often wondered about that. But my feeling is that there are just there are two problems. There are two reasons why it continues. One is there is no way to simply blame this on one faction or another in China. It's going on through the Jiang Zemin, started in Jiang Zemin, and it's still going on with Xi Jinping. That's a problem. So there's no proper scapegoat that you can blame the whole thing on. Even if you took a step away from it. The second thing is there's just too much money in this. This is phenomenal money for the doctors, and there's been signs in the past that that money's flowed into the Politburo as well. We're talking about $1 million, $500,000 per person if they're taken apart the right way and sold to organ tourists. Okay, so I mean that's a lot of money when you're starting to talk about 25, 50,000 people. So I think both of those are huge impediments, and basically the Chinese just say, well, that's not happening, and then they like to they do a scapegoat policies. They find some bad doctor and sort of say he was doing something bad, and they arrest him and they shoot him, and it's all very public, and they do that once a year. So I mean, you can set your watch by it practically. And the other thing that's happening in the West is a lot of people are trying to revive the idea that this is happening all over the world. It is not happening all over the world. Okay, it's happening in a few countries which took their lead from China. One was ISIS, which doesn't really exist anymore. They were doing organ harvesting. North Korea, which definitely got some training from China, and Vietnam, which actually ended up not really doing it, even though the Chinese were pushing it very hard on them. We do have some new information in Kazakhstan indicating that they're possibly doing forced kidney harvesting at a very low level. But nonetheless, that is a sign of the contagion. One last point about that. We are not talking about normal contagion. This is not a virus, exactly. Really what it is an attempt by the Chinese transplant industry to normalize deviance, medical deviance, globally. So when the Chinese talk about reform of organ harvesting, they're really talking about getting other countries to do it their way, okay? Because they know this is terrible, and they're a little bit like a child pornography who kind of wants everybody looking at child pornography. Okay, and I think the Vatican has played into that, but that's a whole other story. Well, they have played into it, but the interesting thing is, I'm just saying, the interesting thing here is that now I don't think China's been totally successful at that, but they've certainly tried, and were very effective at getting medical communities initially in the West to go along with it. What broke that? Us? Because we did such great research? No, COVID. Okay, that's why doctors are changing their minds, because they have had to carry Beijing's water for a couple of years, and they hated it, and they hated everything about it, and they hated the World Health Organization for their lies. So I think that's where this rebellion is really coming from in the medical world, and because COVID has destroyed Chinese credibility in the medical sphere.
It's interesting. One of the interesting aspects too, and I know you've talked about it, is that much of many of the elements of the surveillance state technology that the Chinese are advancing, they use there on the Uyghurs first. So things both, photo, image detection, but even as sophisticated as the way somebody walked. Gait analysis as being something that they want to test out.
Well, they've got the racial analysis. That's where they first did it, was in the Uyghur community. There's no question. I met the guy, interviewed him, the guy who came up with the algorithm. He's a Uyghur. He was in Istanbul. He gave me a very honest interview, though. Of course, he's not happy about how it's being used. But the other thing that they came up with, as well as gait recognition, which is really interesting stuff, but it gets a lot of false positives and things. No, the most interesting thing is you can measure stress. That camera can see stress. You can see how your blood is moving on your skin in a way that the human eye really can't detect. I mean, we can kind of detect it through other signals, something about the eyes and so forth. Mm-hmm. Not really. This can actually physically detect stress. And so, in fact, they set it up so that if you said, here's a Uyghur walking down the street, that's a 60% score that he's guilty. And he's stressed out, that's 30%, right? And he's walking fast, that's 90% arrested. Okay, it's just like, that's how they did it. And that is because, Xinjiang, they consider these people to be subhuman, and it's their laboratory, okay? It's been their laboratory for new forms of organ harvesting as well, using new techniques. And and so forth. And so I think this is it's a wide open. This is a wide open area. It's always been really, really interesting to me for that reason. It's a great area to look at.
Now, we've talked in the past about Taiwan. You spent, I think, about a year there. I can't remember the precise amount.
It was about 6-7 months.
7 months. Okay, you were there for about 7 months, and
yeah.
You have the perspective of a little bit more time. We talked last time too. I should probably preface too. We talked about the elections there. Perhaps we can talk again about. Do you think that the Taiwanese are getting better prepared?
I couldn't say for sure. I think I think there are some signs of it, but the key problem is that when the Green wins, when it isn't the KMT candidate, it's the DPP, and they come in, they do not. This goes back a long ways in Taiwanese history. They don't get on with the army.
Right.
And that is a key problem, which is why, I've even made the suggestion to Senator Cotton's staff. I don't know if they ever relayed it up to him, but said, look, you really need to get an American military guy over there secretly or whatever to kind of knock heads on this, to make people cooperate. They've got to get over that stuff. The DPP is going to keep getting elected. The Greens are going to keep getting elected, right? The KMT is not fielding the candidates that can really win. But they've got to work with the army, and this standoff, this Mexican standoff, is going to stop. So I think that's a major element. The other element, though, is that it looks like. My guess. I know both you guys must have your own opinions on this. It's anybody's game here, but my guess is that when Hamas attacked Israel, which was right in the Chinese playbook. They literally said, we'll have a war in Europe, Ukraine, and have a war in the Middle East, and America will be so tied up that it will not be, it won't really be ready to defend Taiwan. That was the theory. And I believe that has a lot to do with the Iranians giving the go-ahead to Hamas at that time, on October 7th. But what's interesting is that Israel, which was a basket case of political hatred and factionalism, and has been for several years, came together. It was absolutely miraculous how quickly it came together, and that unity government and so forth. There's been very, very. That's got to scare the Chinese a little bit. Scare Beijing, because it indicates we've seen now that happen twice. Not as well in the Ukrainian case, but NATO did come together, and certainly in the Israeli case, the country came together, which is why they're probably going to go on and finish the job regardless of what Biden says. So I think if you're China, you've got to look at those clues, because that would happen in Taiwan. Now, it is also true that I read polls while I was there that have not been published that were done asking young people if they were ready to defend the country, and the results are actually very good. So it's not kind of like the results you'll get here or in England or something, where they'll be like, maybe, right? No, I think so. I think that's probably true. But the problem, of course, here is that Biden has not proven he's not scary. It's that simple. Trump is scary and Biden is not. I just put it that way and leave it there. And if I were the Chinese, I'd be still looking at this and sort of saying, if we go now, we maybe we can take it, Taiwan. But there's one other factor. Everybody thinks of a short war in Taiwan. Now think about it in terms of a long war. And I don't know if you want to talk about this, but this is where the issue of Chinese border crossing comes up in my head. Is that okay to?
Sure, go ahead.
Yep. Mark, I am looking at this with no inner knowledge, no special knowledge. I think this is an open question. It's sort of You might say it's a question of just common sense. But I'm looking at it through a national security lens, okay? So the reason for that is because of the farmland issue, okay? So we had all these Chinese entities buying farmland next to American missile fields and American military bases, especially airfields. That's really very significant, okay? That is not a small thing, that's a big thing. That really indicates that they're thinking of a major world war here. And, I was talking about this with my wife last night, and she was pointing out, she said, well, yeah, but there's so many ways a Chinese spy can get in to America. There's so many ways they can come in just on a tourist visa and then just kind of disappear and change their identity. It's the easiest thing in the world to get new papers. Relatively easy. Okay. And I think that's true, probably. And she may even be right about spies. Okay. I'm thinking a little more in terms of on the ground operatives, sleeper cells. Okay. That can be, that you pull out in an emergency and they just sit there and wait for the moment. And there, I think that, I guess I'll tell you why I think this in a second, but I think that and I'm not talking about 99% of the people coming over those borders, the 99% of the Chinese that are coming across that border, it's up 300%. That's almost all because of the economy is floundering in China, and it's a really good sign of it. But if there's 1% there, or even half of 1%, that are coming in as sleeper cells, if I were making that decision in China, I would not just send people by plane. I would not just send people in with other identities. I wouldn't do that at all. I'd send some in through that southern border. As tough as it is to go from Ecuador, which is where they have to go, and then you've got to actually make your way up through Central America to the border. I would still send people in that way because when I was going into Kazakhstan to do my interviews with Uyghurs who had been in the camps, or Kazakhs who had been in the concentration camps in Xinjiang, I made an effort to drive a car that could not be traced. We encoded all of our devices and then we turned them all off. We relied on burner phones exclusively. We had no Google Maps whatsoever because we did not want to give out an electronic signal. Now, we still crossed a border, okay, well, we went to Georgia, Ukraine, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, and then we crossed the Caspian Sea on a ferry, along with a lot of other truckers. And so they did, do a biometric print and everything like that, but they didn't bother to look us up because it was a father-daughter combination. We looked like hippies. We had funny hats. We had skis on the car. Okay. And, we went into that country and disappeared. We essentially did a sleeper cell kind of operation, went in, interviewed people, and there was no way to kind of trace the fact we'd gone into the country. There's no way to trace the fact that where we were in it at all. Now, if I could have crossed that border without going through that, if I could have gone over a mountain, I would have done it. Okay, if there had been a relatively easy way to do it. If somebody was paying me enough or holding my family hostage, I definitely would have done it. Okay, all right? And that's sort of more the Chinese situation. Okay, I wasn't that dedicated that I was willing to. And actually, Kazakhstan's very hard to get into. The borders have very good surveillance on them, at least electronic. But I would love to see a porous border like that, and I think they would too. That is my guess. Is they would too, and then we get into, and you can all have your own theories on this. I mean, when I think about this, I think about unconventional weapon release, particularly bio. That's what I think of. And anyone who says, "Well, that's really science fiction," it's like, really, after COVID, come on, really. I mean, that's there, and it's extremely likely after COVID. So that's what concerns me here, is because it's bad enough having the southern border open and drugs coming in and all the rest of it. this and the fact that of course ISIS can come in through there too. But this is the worst. This is the worst possible scenario. And the reason I say that is because you look at the Japanese internment in World War II. It was not completely unjustified. It's not the way people have created it. There were some Japanese who were loyal to the emperor, okay? And the Japanese were working on systems of release of anthrax in America. Now, they used weather balloons and so forth, but it was clear they tried to recruit some people in the Japanese community. That is true. Okay, it's not heavily in the records, but it's in the records. And so I'm not saying the Japanese internment camps were not promoting them. I'm not proud of them. I wouldn't look for it. I would hate to see something like that happen to any of the Chinese population. Difference is we have a lot more surveillance these days. We can do sort of limited carnivorous investigation of various communities. We kind of did that after 9/11. But under a full-scale war, and that would be the worst. America comes together during wars, and this would be the greatest tragedy if we end up fighting over woke politics instead, over how to handle the Chinese community. That would be the worst thing and the most divisive thing I can imagine. So that's all the more reason. It may be too late at this point. These things may happen. And
it's interesting though, if to push back on that a little bit, so many Chinese, I mean, Xi's daughter went to Harvard under an assumed name. I mean, there's extensive familiarity that people have had from coming and studying here and what have you. It would seem that you're dealing with students who were have more opportunity to place people in strategically significant roles than somebody coming across the border and without any kind of background or any cover, if you will, to identify why they should be where they were.
I think that's an absolutely valid point. However, those people get monitored. I mean, most of the people coming in through the border in the South, if we had to take a guess, and I'm not down there with a a legal pad.
I take your point. Unlike unlike the students, we probably were following Xi's daughter. Well, hopefully, who knows what who knows? No, one would hope that we were familiar with what she was up to at Harvard and having a sense on that. But you're right. I mean, obviously, those people could potentially under more scrutiny.
Yeah, they are a lot more scrutiny. That's why I'm saying the business of how I would have gone into Kazakhstan if I'd had my druthers. Okay,
right. I understand.
I would have loved to come in completely anonymously. Although that would have been a problem too, because if they looked at my passport, there's a heavy police presence. They were always pulling me over.
Right.
So that could have created as many problems as anything. Although, again, I could have gotten a fake stamp. Okay. Yeah. That's the kind of thing you can pay somebody to do. But here, these people coming from the border, let's assume that they're middle class, or even they're not upper middle class. They have to be a little bit upper middle class because they have to have enough money that they probably saved over the pandemic to, it's nearly $1,000 to get to Ecuador from anywhere in China. It's a huge trip. And then you've got to make your way up and you've got to pay for guides to take you up to the border. But once you get to the border, your chances of getting intercepted are very, very low. And that is the point where when I talk about a bioweapon or something like that, you could try to bring one in a plane. And most of the time, maybe you'd get away with it. A lot of times you would. I mean, it's not like TSA is so effective. But I'd be a lot more confident if I were doing a sleeper cell arrangement, like a couple of places, couple of major cities, and I'd be a lot more confident bringing them up through that southern border on odds. I'd just do the odds and I'd say, you know what, the chances of this actually working are a lot better if I go through that southern border than if I try anything on a flight, anything like that, a cruise ship, all those things. So That's just my opinion. Again,
Certainly.
really, people are entitled to their own
Yeah,
words about this.
certainly.
But this is not a science. Okay. Yeah.
So we've sort of gotten the end. We've talked the fact that you're working on a book. We won't ask what his publication date is, although I gather your publisher would love to be able to move forward on that. What else are you working on these days that you want to share with our audience?
I don't. I'm absolutely just doing this book. I've actually cut off pretty much all communication except for direct line and Congress. Okay, so that's it. Really. No,
your publisher. Your publisher. Your publisher is happy to hear that. So that really brings us to the end of the show. We have a couple of events that are coming up. We have an event with Governor Bob Ehrlich highlighting his book. There's details about buying tickets and attending available on our website. And we also look forward to having dinner, don't we, Don, at Masoni's up in, there you go. See, you've been waiting the entire show for the thumbs up for that dinner at Masoni's up in Baltimore County. Thank you very much, Ethan. It's been great to have you back.
Thank you, Mark.